Hi everyone and welcome back to the channel. In this week's History Speaks, we have a guest that will take us on a journey about one of the most famous ladies in history, but through a sphere many will not even imagine. The lady, of course, is Anne Boleyn, Henry VIII's second wife. But what trauma did she suffer? What were her stress levels? And how did she cope with such a tyrannic husband? So please give a warm welcome to my guest today, Verity Dryden. Hi Verity, how are you?
Morning, John. I'm very well, thank you. Thank you for having me on the show. How are you today?
I'm absolutely fantastic. I'm a bit chilly because it's. I think we're entering that winter mode now, and I'm considering heating going on, but I'm so tired. I'm not going to put it on until like 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock tonight. So that's just me. Now
I've got my plug-in radiator on right now.
Yeah, all right, there you go.
Yeah.
So as always, the first question to any guest is, how did you first become interested in history, and what was your background?
So my actual background, my trained background is illustration. I studied illustration at university, and my professional background is sort of support and social work in employment.
Oh.
So I help adults get back into work. But my love of history comes from years ago. Do you remember the Hollywood adaptation of The Other Blind Girl with Natalie Portman and Scarlett Johansson? I remember years ago, my mum really wanted to go and see it. Now I've only been about 12 years old, and I didn't want to go see this stuffy historical costume drama. And I know it's very divisive, this film. People either love it or hate it. But I came out absolutely besotted with Anne Boleyn, and I had a fantastic history teacher at my secondary school as well, Mrs. Brown, who just sort of stoked the fire of that. So sort of all my free time, I mean, you can't see, but my bookshelf behind me is just groaning under the weight of Tudor literature, fiction and non-fiction. So sort of all my free time is just researching Anne Boleyn.
I mean, your journey then does sound incredibly inspiring, because just going to the cinema, seeing a movie and coming out, and that's it changes your life. So it's clear that your passion has also fueled some remarkable insights. Now, speaking of which, one figure that you have brought to life with such depth and fascination is Anne Boleyn. Now, your story of Anne is a richly deep profile, can I say. Now, can you expand on this and tell us about your fascination of this particular Tudor lady?
So my fascination with Anne is that we know so little and so much about her at the same time. So we know that she craved apples while she was pregnant with Elizabeth I, yet we've got nothing really left in her own hand. We've got a few little scraps of paper because Henry destroyed everything, yet she's become this sort of Tudor figurehead. Like, you can't discuss the Tudor dynasty without your mind going to Anne Boleyn. She was the first Queen of England to be executed. She achieved what other women before her had been unable to achieve. You know, Henry split with Rome to marry Anne. And I just think she's really, really fascinating. And we study Anne so much. So there is so much work out there on Anne, documentaries, films, non-fiction, fiction. And it's always sort of, and there's nothing wrong with that because the story never grows dull, but it's always about sort of her arrest and her execution and that fall from power. And I think sometimes it's quite difficult for an audience to relate to that. Obviously, we don't get our heads chopped off in modern day England. Treason isn't really something that is held in high regard like it was when we had absolute monarchy. So I wanted to look at Anne through a more human microscope, because I think it really humanises somebody when we can understand what's going on a cellular level within the brain and emotionally. And I think when you understand the stresses and the psychological impact of what Anne would have been struggling with, you can't help but feel for her. And it's not so much sympathy. It's well, it is, because obviously we've never really. Well, I will never know what it's like to stand on a scaffold, facing my own mortality. But you can't help but feel empathy for her. And her background as well, her education. She was offered a very broad education under Margaret of Navarre and Margaret of Austria and Queen Claude of France. She was unlike other ladies of her time. She was in a total different league to the women she was surrounded with at the English court. And I think probably the only match for her at that time would have been Catherine of Aragon when it came to intelligence and wit.
Because there was obviously a battle between the two of them anyway, weren't there? So, I mean,
absolutely.
The way you've brought Anne's story to life highlights your deep understanding of her character and experiences. So now, considering the complex world that she navigated, it makes one wonder what the pressures were that she faced daily. So what kind of stress would Anne have gone through? And talking psychological, obviously, did that have an effect in her everyday life?
Yes. So, obviously, as individuals, every single person's got a different capacity and a different tolerance for stress and trauma. And what will have happened with Anne is you've got to remember that Catherine of Aragon was raised to be a queen. Catherine of Aragon was told from the minute she could understand language, you are going to be a queen one day, you're a princess, you're an infanta of Spain, and she was raised to that level. So it's been completely normalised for Catherine from such a young age, where Anne, yes, she was given a fantastic education, but she was never raised to have the pressures of queenship. That was something, yes, maybe a duchess, maybe a high lady married to a high lord, but she was never ever supposed to be queen. It was just something that was not supposed to happen. So you've got these pressures of things that she's not trained in. You've then got the pressures of she's ripped a nation apart effectively through the dissolution of the monasteries, the break from Rome. So she's trying to establish a new status quo within quite an unruly kingdom because people are very much loyal to Catherine of Aragon. Yes, she has a few people within her faction and a few supporters, but people are still predominantly Catholic. There's quite a bit of backlash. And she's even got backlash from some of Henry's biggest supporters, such as St. Thomas More. So she's got all these pressures weighing down on it. And then, of course, you've got the reproductive pressures as well. She has promised Henry a son. And obviously now we know with science that you just cannot do that. You cannot promise somebody what gender of child you're going to give them, because actually it's the father who ultimately determines the gender of the child. But she had all these different pressures weighing down on her. I think she did remarkably well to sort of cope with them for nearly a decade. It's amazing that she sort of didn't, and I say crap very loosely, it's amazing that she didn't sort of fall to these pressures earlier than she did.
Yeah, and we'll get on to the part about promising Henry a son a little bit later. Now, understanding the immense stress Anne endured, it does give us a glimpse into that psychological toll that it must have taken on her. And I imagine capturing that complexity wasn't easy. So how difficult for you was it to get into the mindset of Anne Boleyn?
It is quite difficult. It's quite emotional as well, because one of the biggest things with stress and with trauma and the psychological impact on somebody is control. People like to be in control because you've got, when you look at Anne, we know so little about, we know that she had a furious desire to eat apples, as she'd never had in her life. She told Thomas Wyatt when she was pregnant with Elizabeth. So we know these little key pieces of information about her, but we don't know her thoughts and feelings. But what we've got of her, contemporary sources we have of her, and other information, such as when Elizabeth I was told, they saw her mother beseeching the king with Elizabeth in her arms. That for me is like a what if train. So in trauma, you've got something called a what if train, and that's when you're really anxious and you think, but what if this happens and what if that happens and what? So for me, when I read that source about the Scottish theologian telling Elizabeth about her mum, beseeching King Henry with Elizabeth in her arms, that to me tells me that Anne is on a what if train then. It's quite erratic behaviour, scooping Elizabeth up from the nursery, chasing Henry. Henry, look at our daughter, please don't do anything. That is Anne knowing something's about to happen, but she doesn't know what, but she's on a what if train. And that is an incredibly scary place to be psychologically, because you put yourself under a lot of anxiety, you put yourself under a lot of stress. You can't think straight because you're looking at every single potential area for danger. You're constantly scanning the area for danger. And she knew she was in danger, but I don't think she knew to what extent she was in danger. So to put yourself in that mindset is quite scary, because Anne was under a lot of stress and a lot of psychological pressure. And I think if that is somebody who was under that amount of stress today, we'd be really concerned about them. I think there would be potentially some safeguards put in place.
Do you think that her stress levels reached a point where she thought, this isn't going to end in a good way, and the only way it is going to end is in a really bad way, which we all know it did, because Henry at that particular time wasn't known as a guy who would possibly execute his wives. So it's quite difficult. I mean, yeah, I can understand what you're saying about the stress levels, and yeah, there were probably many, because she wasn't, as you said, brought up as a queen like Catherine of Aragon was. So yeah, we'll move on, because the mindset must have been quite a challenge, I guess, and especially given the many layers to her story, which I think you've already mentioned. Now, the one aspect that stands out is Henry's devotion to her, which seems deeply intertwined with her promise of a boy. So how much of Henry's devotion towards Anne was based on that? She promised him a son.
I think a lot of it was based on that. Obviously, he believed the issue wasn't with him, it was with Catherine of Aragon, as Bessie Blount had given him a son. I still don't understand why Henry didn't just marry Bessie Blount. So, because obviously he'd have had the son then, wouldn't he? He'd have had a son. John of Gaunt wrote to the Pope and Parliament to have his bastard children legitimised. So I don't see why Henry didn't do that. So there must be some devotion outside of Anne just giving him a son that Henry was absolutely besotted with her for, because he already had the son. There was something about Anne that he loved. I do genuinely believe on some level he loved her, whether or not it was completely romantic love like what we would recognise for our spouses today. I don't think it was something like that. I think it was very narcissistic. I think it was very controlling. And also Anne was refreshing. She was completely different to Catherine in the sense that she dressed differently. She also told Henry what he wanted to hear. She was whispering honey in his ear all the time, king's second to God. Yes, I'll give you a son. Let's break from Rome. Where Catherine would absolutely not lay down and take that. Catherine was very, very dignified in her break from Henry and the annulment of her marriage. And Anne wasn't. She was fiery. She had a wicked temper. We know that she lashed out at Henry in public, which was just a completely, it was not the done thing for women to lash out at their husbands in public, let alone the King of England. So Anne was just totally different to Catherine. But then, of course, we see that begin to tire Henry, because then he goes to somebody like Catherine again in Jane Seymour, somebody who's very quiet, somebody who's very subservient. So I think it was a mix of, yes, she's going to give me a son, but I think it was, Anne was very sexy in some ways. Her dress sense, her attitudes, she was very French. Her attitudes, values and beliefs were very French. She was completely different to the Spanish Catherine of Aragon. And I think ultimately that would have attracted Henry. And also she said no. Yeah. He's a spoiled brat. Yeah. Isn't he? She kept saying no. She said no for years. Yeah. And that must have driven him wild. Above all, Henry was a hunter and she would not concede to the chase. So I think there's an element of that there as well. Henry's not getting his own way, and I think he's determined to.
Why do you think he hung around for so long, being told no over the years? Because it went on apparently for about 4 years before they actually consummated their union, if you like, if you want to put it that way. So
Yeah, so I think he first started showing an interest in her around 1526, 1527, and it'll have been 1532 where they consummated the relationship. The back end of 1532 in the December on the way back from Calais. I honestly just do believe it was stubbornness. He is not used to not getting his own way, and I think Anne was a challenge that he just wasn't ready to give up. And obviously, she was, with the benefit of hindsight, she was certainly absolutely brilliant. And he did right not to give up chasing her, because we got Elizabeth I. Obviously, he wouldn't agree with that. But Elizabeth is just an absolutely fantastic monarch and a testament to her mother.
Mm. It is intriguing. I mean, it's intriguing to think about how much of Henry's commitment to Anne was tied to his desire for an heir, which I think is incredible. But beyond their personal relationship, another powerful force at play was propaganda. So what instances have you uncovered in how propaganda may have played a vital role for Anne?
So we have some really fantastic instances of propaganda with Anne, and my favourite is the Most Happy Medal. So with Anne, we know that she was just absolutely French in her attitudes, values and beliefs. We know she was English. She was born in Blickling Hall in Norfolk, and the family later moved to Hever Castle, which is what she's famously associated with. But Anne was French through and through, French in her dress sense. She most likely spoke with a French accent, and she had been there through the most formative years of her life and didn't return to the English court until 1522. So we have this in 1534, Anne is pregnant again. It's supposed to be with a boy. And we have this Most Happy Medal. And as we know, Catherine of Aragon and Jane Seymour wore heavy gable hoods, which look like roofs, which are hence gable, like a gable end. And Anne wore the lovely crescent moon-shaped hood. And in 1534, when she's pregnant with this boy, we have the Most Happy Medals released. It's one of the only sort of portraits we have that we can confirm is Anne and to her likeness. And it was wonderfully recreated by a ceramic artist named Lucy Churchill a couple of years ago. And I actually have that medal somewhere in this room, a little recreation that my husband got for me on our wedding day. And she's wearing a gable hood, which is totally unlike Anne. You know, she was a trendsetter with the low square necklines and the French hoods. So in that, because she wasn't liked by the public, there was very few people who favoured Anne over Catherine of Aragon. So with this propaganda, it's an absolutely brilliant piece of public relations, because she's shown how English she is, even though she's absolutely French through and through, with this gable hood while she's pregnant, and she's got a crucifix around her neck on this Most Happy Medal. She's saying, look, I am English. I'm married to the English king. I'm mother of the future English prince. It's just an absolutely wonderful piece of public relations by and it's absolutely brilliant. Obviously, sadly, she did miscarry that pregnancy, but it when it comes to swaying public opinion and projecting an image of herself that she wants to project, that Most Happy Medal is an absolutely fantastic piece of propaganda by Anne.
How do you think Henry felt about her? And I don't mean, I mean in terms of becoming a mother and a wife, because he had been rejected so many times, I guess, by her. Do you think he had any doubts as to you know, how she would perform, not only as a queen but as a mother to her son? And was she a woman? I'm asking too many questions here, but was she a woman that he thought he'd stay with for the rest of his life if she produced the son?
So I don't think Henry really. I think maybe in the beginning, when he first married her and she was pregnant with Elizabeth, if Elizabeth had been a boy, Anne would have been, and that boy had lived, Anne would have been untouchable. She'd have been completely untouchable. He'd have had mistresses, yes, but Anne would have wanted for nothing. For the rest of her life, Anne would have been completely untouchable. But he tired of Anne quite quickly, because unlike Catherine of Aragon, who was very subservient, and yes, you're my husband, okay, I'm a wife, Anne was used to being a mistress, and a mistress would be in control of her male counterpart, where when you become a wife, you are subservient, the husband is in charge, and Anne wasn't used to that. So we have records of Anne lashing out publicly at her husband, biting back at him. She wasn't ready. There was that famous one where she's about to go into her confinement when she's pregnant. And she says to Henry, don't take any mistresses. And he says, remember, I raised you, madam, and I can put you back where I've taken you from. They're not the exact words, but he basically said, close your eyes and look away and do better, as you betters have done before you. And he's basically then remembering Catherine of Aragon was really subservient. She never batted an eyelid at his mistresses. Of course, Catherine would have been heartbroken. She genuinely did love Henry from what we know, but she just turned a blind eye. She turned away and pretended she never saw it and just ignored it, where Anne was not prepared to roll over and let her husband whore and adulter in her adultery with other women. She was just not prepared to do that. And I think Henry did not like that element of Anne. When she was a mistress, that was really sexy. But when she was a wife, it was a complete turn off, and he did not enjoy that side to his wife.
It is strange how relationships change from, not every relationship, but some do just change from when you're courting somebody to going over that line and into marriage. It just completely, the people just change for some reason. Anyway, we're not going to get stuck down in all that. I can understand, though, the impact of the propaganda shaping Anne's public image, and it's fascinating, adds a complex layer to her story. Yet, despite all the turbulence, there must have been moments of triumph and joy in her life. So, from what you know, what do you think were the best moments in her life? And on the other side of that, was the ending for her a complete shock or expected?
I think the best moment for her was probably a coronation. I think that was the highest she was ever going to get. Obviously, that is with hindsight. For her, the crowning moment would have been giving birth to a live, healthy boy. But sadly, that never happened. So really, if I was going to look at the facts and figures and sort of take the human element out of it, her coronation, she was the only one of Henry's wives, aside from Catherine of Aragon, to be given a coronation. She was crowned on St. Edward the Confessor's chair, which is just reserved for monarchs. So that's really, really interesting. And that was Sunday, the 1st of June, 1533. And of course, under her girdle, she was carrying Elizabeth I. She was 6 months pregnant at this point. Everybody was, it's going to be a boy. It's going to be a boy. So she's crowned Queen of England in her own right alongside Henry. Of course, she wasn't an absolute monarch like Henry. She was queen pregnant alongside him. And she's pregnant with their presumptive. Of course, little did they know it would be Elizabeth I, but I think that's a really big moment in her career. And of course, when she becomes Marquess of Pembroke as well, her lands, titles, wealth, riches, she becomes a very rich and wealthy lady in her own right then. But I would absolutely say her coronation. It's one thing being married, but coronation is sort of cementing her right to be there. And I think that is probably the highest Anne was ever going to get, because only in September, when she gives birth to Elizabeth, the foundations of her queenship's already rocked. She hasn't given birth to the boy. So it's a very slow decline from the minute she gives birth to Elizabeth, in my opinion.
Yeah, I was going to say, because the next 3 years are, as you've just said, a steady decline, aren't they? Until the end. But do you think she expected the ending as it actually happened, though? Do you think there was that much fear after that birth of Elizabeth and it started to go downhill that, she thought, this is not going to end well?
She did remarkably well to face her own mortality within the tower, but we do know that she was going from manic and hysterical laughter to fits of sobbing. And she was making really dark jokes, like, I have such a little neck, when she was told she was going to be beheaded. I think she thought there would be a last minute reprieve. I think she thought Henry's done this to frighten her, to sort of bring her into heel, so to speak, and to get her to behave, or he sent her to a nunnery. I don't think she actually thought she was going to die. But I think she did remarkably well, but you can see the psychological effects through contemporary sources of what was happening to her in the tower, like the manic, hysterical laughter, and then fits of sobbing. It's almost a complete shutdown mentally. That would have been to protect herself. It was total helplessness, which is a very dark place to be mentally and emotionally. And it's really, really sad when you actually understand what is happening to your brain at those points. But also crying releases oxytocin. So crying is almost giving yourself a hug as well. It's a stress response, it's a stress release, crying, but it's also, she's completely shutting down emotionally. It's really sad.
It's an incredible turn of events from what should have been happiness and joy for everybody, regardless whether it's a boy or a girl. A birth is, and I guess more so in those days because the standards were completely different, weren't they? It's not like it is today where you've got surrounded by people and everything's clean and, it's just completely different. So yeah, it's heartbreaking to consider how things unraveled so quickly for her. But moving on to the ending, if you like, the sheer number of others convicted alongside her raises important questions about the motivations and forces at play. So can you put into words why so many others were convicted alongside Anne?
So this is really, really fascinating. Thomas Cromwell is a complete apex predator. He is a very intelligent man. I wouldn't want to be on the wrong side of him if he was alive today. I certainly wouldn't want him to be one of my colleagues in an office job because he would run rings around you. He was really, really dangerous man. And he was purely for Henry. He was Henry's man. And what he does here is when Henry says he wants to be rid of Anne, he takes himself away from court for a month and he comes up with this completely fictionalized, made up story of what Anne's been doing behind Henry's back. But the reason he convicts these other men alongside Anne is because it needs to be believable, and it's effectively a coup d'etat of the Boleyn faction. So in order to get rid of Boleyn, he knows, and it's also weakening the Boleyn name as well, because obviously she's accused alongside her brother George. That means no Boleyns left because George is the Boleyn heir and he hasn't got any children through his wife, so the Lady Rochford. So George Boleyn's accused because obviously if Anne was accused on her own, George would petition the king. So George would be somebody waving the banner for her. He'd want his sister protected. And William Brereton, Henry Norris, and Sir Francis Weston are all part of the Boleyn faction as well. So to effectively wipe out her supporters is totally wiping out any chance of a reprieve for Anne. It's totally getting rid of her because at this point, Anne and Cromwell aren't getting on. She's publicly threatened to have his head at this point. So Thomas knows it's him or Anne. One of them has to go. And if he leaves any of her supporters alive, they can beg for mercy from the king. And sometimes Henry, we think of Henry as a tyrant. He absolutely was a tyrant and he absolutely was a monster, but he was really easily manipulated by the people around him. And all it would take is, say, William Brereton or Sir Francis Weston catching Henry on a good day and Anne would be back out and back at court. And Thomas could not risk that. So Mark's meeting being a servant, it just makes it that little bit more believable that she's sunk to that level. She's so desperate. She was so desperate for carnal relations that she's sunk to the level with a servant, effectively a musician, but he was also not allowed to torture Sir Francis Weston, Henry Norris, William Brereton, George Boleyn because they were nobles, but he could torture William. He could torture Mark Smeaton, so he could get a false confession out of him. And so nobody's going to question if it's false when he's getting tortured and he's getting rope tightened around his forehead. So that just strengthens Thomas Cromwell's charges against Anne. He also arrested Thomas Wyatt, Anne's childhood friend, but Thomas Wyatt was later released, which also adds to the believability factor of these charges. Well, we've arrested some people and we've released some of them, so they're innocent, but the others, all right, well, yeah, what are the odds that it must be more believable? If you read something like that in the newspaper, you'd think, oh, well, they've released some, so it must be, they must have evidence against the others. So it just adds the believability factor. He's a complete apex predator, and and what he does is brilliant, evil, but absolutely brilliant. He's a very intelligent man, and he is absolutely the villain of this story, but he's following orders. Henry wanted rid of her. He didn't have to go to the lengths that he did, but what a brilliant man. But absolutely, he's a super villain, Thomas Cromwell. He's excellent.
So yeah, the widespread convictions surrounding Anne do paint a vivid picture of the intense political and personal turmoil at the time. And considering everything that she endured, composure during those final moments on the scaffold are deeply poignant. Now, a speech on the scaffold was obviously a very sad time, and given what we know, how do you think she coped in those final moments?
To put it simply, I think she coped absolutely marvellously. She was straight to the point with her speech, "Good Christian people, I come hither to die, for according to the law and by the law I am judged to die, and therefore I will speak nothing against it. I am come hither to accuse no man, nor to speak anything of that whereof I am accused and condemned to die. But I pray God save the king and send him long to reign over you. For a gentler nor merciful prince was there never, and to me he was ever a good, a gentle and sovereign lord. And if any person will meddle of my cause, I require them to judge best, and thus I take my leave of the world and of you all, and I heartily desire you all to pray for me. O Lord, have mercy on me. To God I commend my soul." It's just, so when you dissect that, she's saying she's not come to speak of the men she was accused with. So she's not come to further, even though we know she was innocent, we know Cromwell's just got a very vivid imagination when it comes to creating tall tales about what Anne's been up to at extramarital affairs. When she says she's come to speak nothing of what she's been accused, she's refusing to further implicate herself, although she's accused alongside of, by refusing to speak more on these supposed incidents she's been involved in. And she pairs this marvellously by refusing to slander her former husband, in refusing to insult Henry. She's also protecting her daughter, Elizabeth, because obviously she's leaving one little piece of her in the world, and that's Elizabeth. And Elizabeth is barely 3 years old. And Elizabeth will now solely rely on her father for protection and safety. Of course, their nuclear families weren't like ours, where like mum and dad would look after the kids, and your king and queen, she would have nannies and obviously like her wards and stuff. But she'd be in Hatfield House getting looked after, so she wouldn't be actually getting raised by Henry. But Henry, of course, being her father, we've seen how he treated Mary. So basically Anne's doing what she can there. She's pulling out all the stops to try and protect Elizabeth in her final moments. It's a composure towards the end of her speech is nothing short of admirable. She's facing her own mortality, and she faces it with remarkable courage and grace, considering what we know of her behaviour while she's imprisoned within the tower, such as the manic laughing and then the historical sobbing, and sort of swapping between those two behaviours, and then making dark jokes about having such a little neck. I think the way she conducts herself on the scaffold when she addresses a crowd of nearly 1,000 people is marvellous.
It's unbelievable to imagine that. I can't imagine myself, and I'm guessing nobody can, of being in that sort of position, standing there, saying your final words before somebody's about to chop your head off, which is quite possibly one of the most horrific ways to go. Even though people say it's quick, it's still an horrific way to depart this world, isn't it? And to stand there and physically talk, it's beyond belief, really.
To be able to project your voice enough that somebody's got an accurate record of what you've said. It's a violent way to go, isn't it? Getting your head chopped off. Yes, it's over in a split second. But we now know that the brain's still active for like a minute afterwards and stuff. So, there are sources that her mouth was moving after her head was removed, whether or not that's true. But she to handle that. But I also think as well, there was probably a slight bit of hope that there was going to be a last minute reprieve in there for her, that Henry was going to show up and, oh, stop it. But she handled that marvellously. And I think the fact that Henry has hired a swordsman from Calais before she'd even been convicted and charged is just so it's insidious. It's predatory. It's insidious. She was never getting out of the Tower alive.
It's not just herself. It's everybody else as well who face that, type of ending. It's and yet they always praised the king, don't they? They always have a good word for him, and that's one thing that I think is hard to understand. I guess obviously different times and everything, but they always praised the king when they were about to die.
Absolutely. I mean, if it was us now, we'd be like, oh, yeah,
you'd be screaming.
Yeah, we'll be screaming bloody Mary. We'll be giving him what for verbally, and da. But it's because obviously the king, absolute tyrant, absolute monarch. So it was to try and protect their family. So Henry didn't come after lands, titles, wealth, didn't disinherit people. So it was a last-ditch effort for Henry to sort of look favourably upon the innocent members of the family, because obviously Henry just sort of tarred everybody with the same brush. So if Anne had done something, all of the Boleyns are out of favour. The only Boleyn who sort of escaped that relatively unscathed was Mary, Anne's sister.
Yeah, it's I don't know. There's no words can describe it, I guess, at the end of the day. I mean, the strength that she showed, as we've said in the final moments, is remarkable. And it makes you wonder about the immense pressures that she faced throughout her life. Now, Anne Boleyn forms a central part of the Thomas Cromwell story and he of hers. Having been unable to produce a male heir for the king, Henry sought a removal, which we touched on earlier. Now, by 1536, the uneasy alliance that had existed between Anne and Cromwell had broke down. Why do you think there was so much tension between the pair?
So if we look at Thomas and Anne's relationship, it really is a political relationship. They were in bed together as allies, obviously not physically in bed together. Thomas Cromwell and Anne were both staunch religious reformists. So Thomas was absolutely going to back Anne. He was an astute legal mind. However, he was the king's man through and through. And when Anne started to fail in her queenly duties, such as providing a male heir, she wasn't behaving with the expected royal decorum, lashing out at Henry in public, being quite verbally abusive, probably not by our standards. Of course, there was different standards of language back then. She just wasn't behaving as she was expected to do so. Thomas knew he had to start distancing himself from Anne. And also when the dissolution of the monasteries came about, Thomas was redirecting that wealth into Henry's royal coffers, and Anne wanted that money to go back into similar services, but of course without sort of fake religious effigies. They found a lot of the monasteries had like the blood of Christ, but it was actually the blood of a local chicken from a local farmer or something like that, and they were getting people to pay to be blessed by this blood and stuff. So obviously Anne wanted the money to go back into these services, and Henry and Thomas absolutely not. And because Anne was so strong-minded and much had an idea in her head, that was it. She was like a dog with a bone. Thomas and Anne started to fall out. Anne wanted that money to be used for good. Thomas, being Henry's man, just wanted to line the royal coffers, do his job, and switch off. So when Henry starts to express distaste and disdain for his wife, Thomas knows it's a shoo-in for him. He knows he can use this to climb the ladder. And again, it sort of just shows how predatory Thomas Cromwell is. And I mean, everybody at court has to have an element of predatorial behaviour to them, because you've got to get ahead. It is kill or be killed. So like I said earlier, Henry is very easily manipulated. But Anne, as well, at this point, because she's fallen out with Thomas, she's publicly threatening to have his head. And she even gets her distributor of arms, John Skip, to give a sermon that vilifies and slanders Thomas Cromwell in a really clever way. He gives a sermon on an evil counsellor from the Bible, and it's shots fired at Thomas Cromwell publicly. So it's open warfare now, and they both know it's you or me. One of us has got to go. There's not enough room in this palace for the both of us. So yeah, at the beginning, if they'd have worked together and continued down that same path, they would have been an unstoppable couple in a platonic sense. They'd have been remarkable. But Thomas probably could have protected Anne to some extent from Henry's wrath. But he didn't want to. Thomas was just as ambitious as Anne, and in this case, he came out on top. He won. I know it's very cliche, but he sort of won the Game of Thrones. He won that chess match, and he just outmaneuvered her.
And I guess, ironically, he went the same way as Anne in the end anyway.
Yes, he did. I believe on the same day that Henry VIII married Anne's cousin, Catherine Howard.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. It's amazing. It's fascinating to listen. Anyway, Verity, that's all the questions I've got for you today. So, where can people find out more about yourself and, of course, this upcoming book and any other social media sites you'd like to share?
So I am on Instagram. That is pretty much my only platform for this, because I work full time as well. So having multiple social media platforms would just be too much like hard work for me. Yeah. So I am on Instagram and I'm at the Tudor Book, and it's under EV Dryden. My profile picture is a little profile picture of Anne Boleyn, and it says the funky historian because I am covered in tattoos. So you can't miss me with my little bald head.
Well, it's nice. It's nice to see a different hairstyle, I guess. We'll put it that way. Something a bit different. I'm sure you'll be inundated with new followers. And don't forget, everybody, Verity's link, as I should say, will be in the description box below. So, Verity, thank you so much for sharing your incredible insights into the life of Anne Boleyn. Your passion.
You're very welcome.
And deep knowledge have truly brought her story to life, from her moments of triumph to the intense struggles she faced. And it's been a fascinating conversation. And I know our listeners will walk away with, let's say, a greater understanding of this remarkable Tudor queen. So thank you again for joining us and shedding new light on Anne's enduring legacy.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for having me, John. I've really enjoyed it.
It's been great. It's been great to have you on. And as always, to everyone who's tuned in today, thank you so much. We've still got some more incredible guests coming on History Speaks. So if you love history, you'll love History Roadshow. And don't forget to like, which is one of those, subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss any more of our historical stories. So until next time, keep exploring the past with us, and we'll see you in the next video. Bye for now.